The village ledger was not merely a book of numbers. It was a record of every lie the winter intended to tell. Clarissa Penhaligon stood in the hollowed-out center of the Oakhaven grain silo, her fingers tracing the rough, splintered grain of the oak planks. The air here tasted of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming frost. It was a cold that did not merely sit upon the skin, but seemed to audit the very marrow of one's bones. Beside her, Martha Higgins held a sputtering tallow candle, the flame casting long, wavering shadows against the stone walls. The silence between them was heavy, measured by the rhythmic, distant drip of meltwater from the eaves. There was no grain left to shift, no golden heaps of barley to run through one's fingers. There was only the grey floor and the mathematical certainty of ruin. Clarissa opened the ledger, the vellum pages stiff and protesting in the damp air. Her ink-stained fingers, calloused by a decade of stewardship, moved with a precision that bypassed emotion. She did not weep for the empty stores. She did not curse the sky for the early frost that had blackened the northern fields. She simply counted. To be hungry was to be desperate, and to be desperate was to be reckless, but Clarissa Penhaligon was neither. She was an architect of survival, and her weapon was the decimal point. She noted the remaining stores of salted pork, the dwindling sacks of rye, and the exact weight of the village's communal flour. The deficit was not a vague fear. It was a figure, written in black ink, that equated to 42 deaths before the spring thaw. The door to the silo groaned on its rusted hinges, admitting a swirl of frozen mist and the looming figure of Silas Blackwood. He did not enter so much as he invaded the space, his heavy wool coat smelling of wet horse and expensive tobacco. Blackwood, the magistrate whose authority was as brittle as it was absolute, held a parchment in his gloved hand. He refused to glance at the empty silos, nor did he acknowledge the shivering Martha Higgins. He looked only at Clarissa, his eyes narrowing with a predatory sort of satisfaction. He placed the parchment atop the village ledger, obscuring Clarissa's meticulous rows of figures with the jagged, arrogant seal of the Hartford estate. The notice was a death warrant signed in the elegant hand of the Crown's tax collector. It demanded a triple levy for the winter quarter, a sum that exceeded the village's total liquid assets by 400%. Silas Blackwood spoke with a voice that was level, almost academic in its cruelty, explaining that the estate's lord required the funds to offset the losses of the failed harvest elsewhere. It was a matter of logistics, he claimed, not of malice. Clarissa Penhaligon did not flinch. She did not beg. She stood with a spine as straight as the columns of her ledger, her gaze fixed on the gold ring on Blackwood's finger. She understood the language of extortion perfectly. It was merely a different form of accounting. When the magistrate finally departed, the silence that returned was absolute, broken only by Martha's ragged, shallow breathing. Clarissa closed the book. The decision was not born of heat or anger. It was a cold deduction. She thought of her sister, Elspeth Penhaligon, whose cough had turned from a seasonal nuisance to a rattling, hollow sound that echoed through their small cottage at night. Elspeth needed warmth, medicine, and a level of nutrition that Oakhaven could no longer provide. If the village paid the tax, they would starve. If they did not pay, the magistrate's men would seize their remaining livestock and burn the cottages to the ground. There was no third option within the law. Consequently, Clarissa realized she would have to look outside of it. She looked at the Hartford seal on the notice. Julian Vane was arriving in a fortnight to oversee his ancestral lands and host the seasonal gathering. He would bring with him the heart of Hartford, a sapphire of such immense value that its sale could feed 3 counties for a decade. It was a matter of survival, not of sparkle. The Hartford estate was a monument to the gravity of old money, a sprawling fortress of grey stone and polished mahogany that seemed to suck the warmth from the surrounding countryside. On the night Julian Vane hosted the grand dinner for the county gentry, the manor breathed with the artificial life of 1,000 beeswax candles. Clarissa Penhaligon moved through the servants' entrance, her bombazine dress a dull shadow against the velvet livery of the footman. She had not come as a guest, nor truly as a thief, but as a ghost of the village's insolvency. She had spent a week memorizing the house's internal geometry, auditing the patterns of the guards and the rhythmic swinging of the baize doors. She did not rush. She did not tremble. She walked with the quiet, authoritative gait of someone who belonged to the house's administrative soul. The ballroom above her was a chaotic symphony of silk and violins, but Clarissa stayed in the margins, where the air smelled of floor wax and lavender water. She had calculated the moment of the Duke's first toast, the precise 3-minute window when the security in the private study would be thinnest. Julian Vane, the Duke of Hertford, was a man defined by his distance. From her vantage point behind a marble pillar, Clarissa saw him, a figure of stiff posture and winter-grey eyes, standing at the head of the long table. He looked less like a celebrant and more like a man enduring a sentence. He wore the fabled heirloom pinned to his lapel, the sapphire catching the light and fracturing it into 1,000 cold, blue shards. It was not a jewel, it was a vault. Clarissa moved upward, her footsteps muffled by the thick runners of the back staircase. The study door was locked with a double-lever mechanism, a triviality for a woman who had spent her youth repairing the intricate clockwork of the village mill. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small, slender piece of tempered wire. She did not pick the lock with haste. She felt for the tension, the internal logic of the tumblers, counting the clicks in her mind until the mechanism surrendered. The room was dark, smelling of old parchment and the sharp, acidic scent of expensive ink. Near the window, George Miller, the Duke's bar, passed through the adjacent dressing room, his shadow a silent sentinel that Clarissa avoided with practiced precision. She saw the sapphire resting on a velvet cushion atop the mantel. Julian Vane must have removed it before the final dance, a small concession to the weight of the stone. It sat there, glowing with an internal, malevolent light, surrounded by a delicate gold filigree that looked like frozen lightning. Clarissa approached it with the same reverence she gave to a finalized audit. She did not see a king's ransom. She saw 10 carats of grain, 3 carats of medicine, and a pound of coal for every hearth in Oakhaven. She reached out, her fingers stained with the ink of her village's misery, and lifted the jewel from its resting place. It was heavier than she had anticipated, a dense, cold mass that seemed to pulse against her palm. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Clarissa did not gasp. She did not panic. She slipped the sapphire into a hidden pocket, sewn into the lining of her skirts, and moved toward the window. The ledge was narrow, the stone slick with the evening's dampness, but she had climbed the silos of Oakhaven since she was a child. She swung herself over the sill just as the door to the study opened. The sound of boots on the hardwood floor followed her into the night air. She did not look back. She descended the ivy-covered trellis with a methodical, practiced grace, her mind already moving toward the next phase of the calculation. The forest surrounding the estate was a labyrinth of black trunks and silver frost, but Clarissa Penhaligon moved through it with the certainty of a mapmaker. She did not run. She walked at a pace that minimized her breathing, listening for the baying of hounds that had not yet been released. She reached the ruined mill at the edge of the village territory an hour before dawn. The building was a skeleton of timber and stone, its water wheel long since frozen into a static circle of ice. Inside, away from the prying eyes of Silas Blackwood's informants, Clarissa sat on a pile of dry sacking and pulled the stolen pendant from her pocket. She intended to pry the stone from its setting, to break the wealth into manageable pieces that could be traded in the docks of the capital. But as she held the sapphire up to the grey, pre-dawn light, she noticed a hairline fracture in the gold, not a flaw but a seam. It was a line so precise it could only have been made by a master horologist. Her fingers, trained by years of fine accounting and mechanical repair, found the hidden catch at the base of the setting. She did not hesitate. She pressed the gold stud, and the sapphire did not break. It opened. The jewel was a mechanical locket, its interior lined with silver so thin it was translucent. Inside was not another stone, but a tightly furled sliver of vellum, no larger than a child's fingernail. Clarissa's heart, which had remained steady through the theft and the flight, gave a singular violent thud against her ribs. She used a needle from her lapel to carefully extract the parchment. As she unrolled it, the ink was revealed, a cramped, desperate script that she recognized instantly from the tax notices. It was the handwriting of Silas Blackwood, but the words were a confession of a decade-old treason, a record of the embezzlement that had ruined the Duke's father and placed the son under a crushing, permanent debt. This was the Blackwood pardon, the leverage Julian Vane had likely sought for years. The mechanical vault did not contain wealth. It contained the Duke's heart, his vulnerability, his literal legal standing, and the proof that the man who was currently starving her village was the same man who had destroyed the Vane legacy. She was no longer a common thief. She was the holder of the only truth that could balance the scales. The wind outside the mill howled, a long, mournful sound that signaled the start of a blizzard, but Clarissa Penhaligon did not feel the cold. She felt the weight of the leverage in her hand. The audit of their lives was finally beginning, and for the first time in her life, the numbers were in her favor. She folded the vellum, snapped the jewels shut, and waited for the dawn. The dawn was a pale, anemic thing, a thin wash of grey that failed to penetrate the thick, rolling mist of the Oakhaven Valley. Clarissa Penhaligon walked with a measured, deliberate gait, her boots crunching through the frost-crusted grass as she moved from the ruined mill toward the outskirts of the village. The massive sapphire hung heavy in the hidden pocket of her skirts, a cold weight that seemed to pulse against her thigh with every step. She did not run. She did not glance over her shoulder. To run was to invite suspicion, and Clarissa had spent too many years managing the village's accounts to allow a lack of composure to ruin a calculated risk. She reached the small, stone cottage at the edge of the woods just as the first chimney smoke began to rise from the neighboring roofs. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried pennyroyal and the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke from a dying fire. It was a space defined by a frugal, meticulous order, the scrubbed pine table, the neatly stacked hymnals, and the shelf of ledgers that documented the slow, agonizing decline of the Penhaligon family. On a narrow bed near the hearth, Elspeth Penhaligon lay beneath a patchwork quilt, her face a translucent shade of ivory. Her breathing was a series of shallow, rhythmic gasps, a sound that Clarissa had come to measure against the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The younger sister's cough had quieted with the morning, but the heat of fever still radiated from her brow, a silent audit of the illness that the cold and the famine had brought into their home. Clarissa did not immediately go to the hearth. She moved to the table, and with fingers that remained steady, despite the exhaustion clawing at her mind, she withdrew the sapphire. In the grey, morning light of the cottage, the legendary jewel proved even more remarkable than it had been in the shadows of the mill. She placed it upon the scarred wood and leaned in, her analytical mind already stripping away the beauty of the stone to find the logic beneath. She had spent a decade repairing the intricate gears of the village's mechanical looms and the heavy iron clockwork of the mill. She knew the language of metal as well as she knew the grammar of debt. The sapphire was not merely a gemstone, it was a mechanical vault, a masterpiece of horological engineering disguised as a king's ransom. Clarissa traced the hairline seam with a needle, her touch light and investigative. She noticed that the gold filigree surrounding the stone was not merely decorative. It was a series of interconnected levers, so small they were almost invisible to the naked eye. Each golden leaf had to be depressed in a specific mathematical sequence to release the central sapphire. It was a lock that required more than force. It required the mind of a cryptographer. As she worked, she realized the sheer level of paranoia required to create such a thing. Julian Vane had not carried this jewel for vanity. He had carried it because it was a portable fortress, the only place safe enough to hide the truth of his own ruin. She looked again at the sliver of vellum she had extracted at the mill, now resting beside the jewel. The Blackwood pardon was a confession of embezzlement, a record of how Silas Blackwood had diverted the Hertford estate's funds into his own private ventures, framing the previous duke for the resulting insolvency. It was a matter of percentages and decimal points, a crime of accounting that had been used to keep the current duke in a state of permanent, crushing debt. Julian Vane was not the tyrant Oakhaven believed him to be. He was a man being bled dry by the same magistrate who was now demanding a triple tax from the village. The realization was a sharp, cold blow to her internal ledger. The duke and the thief were, in the eyes of the law of consequences, partners in the same tragedy. Clarissa's eyes drifted to Elspeth, whose hand had twitched in her sleep. The girl needed the medicine that only the apothecary in the city could provide, a luxury that cost more than the village's entire winter grain store. Clarissa felt the familiar, cold pressure of responsibility. She could sell the sapphire to a fence and save her sister. But the vellum, the truth contained within the vault, could save the entire county from Blackwood's predatory stewardship. It was a calculation of lives against a single life, a balance sheet that Clarissa found impossible to reconcile. She stood, her bombazine skirts rustling in the silence, and moved to the hearth to stir the embers. She would need a fire, not just for warmth, but to prepare the bitter herbal tea that kept Elspeth's lungs from seizing. The peace of the cottage was shattered by the distant rhythmic thud of hooves on frozen mud. Clarissa did not startle. She moved to the window, pulling back the heavy linen curtain by a mere fraction. Through the shifting mist, she saw the dark silhouettes of horses approaching the village green. Silas Blackwood was not a man of patience. He had discovered the theft at the manor, and he had wasted no time in bringing his authority to bear upon the people he already considered his property. Clarissa felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. She took the sapphire and the vellum, and slipped them into a hollowed-out space beneath the floorboards, hidden under the heavy iron leg of the wood stove. She did not hide the village ledger. That she kept on the table, a weapon of record that she was prepared to use. Outside, the air was suddenly filled with the discordant sounds of a village being awakened by force. Silas Blackwood rode at the head of a dozen armed men, their heavy wool coats dark with the morning's dampness. He did not dismount. He sat atop his black stallion, his gaze sweeping over the thatched roofs and the shivering figures of the villagers as they were driven from their homes. Martha Higgins was the first to be brought before him, her apron white against the grey mud, her hands folded with a dignity that age had only sharpened. Blackwood did not speak with the volume of an angry man. He spoke with the level, terrifying precision of a man who held the power of life and death in his signature. He demanded to know who had been seen near the Hertford estate the previous night. He spoke of a royal jewel, a sacred trust of the crown, and the dire consequences for any village that harbored a thief. The villagers remained silent, a collective, stoic resistance born of centuries of enduring the whims of the gentry. Martha Higgins kept her gaze off the magistrate. She looked at the frost on the ground, her spine as straight as a pike. Blackwood's irritation flickered in the narrowing of his eyes, a small predatory shift that Clarissa recognized from the tax negotiations. He motioned for one of his men to step forward, a man holding a torch that smelled of pitch and impending ruin. Blackwood's voice carried through the thin air, reaching Clarissa inside her cottage. He announced that if the thief did not come forward, he would begin with the stewardship's records. He would burn the steward's cottage and every ledger within it, effectively erasing the village's legal standing and the records of their communal debts. It was a threat of total social annihilation. To burn the records was to leave the village with no defense against his future claims, no proof of what they had already paid, and no record of the grain they were owed. It was not an act of justice, it was an act of erasure. Clarissa watched as the man with the torch moved toward her door. She looked at Elspeth, who had finally stirred, her eyes wide with a confused, clouded terror. The girl could not be moved into the cold. The transition would be a death sentence for her fragile lungs. Clarissa did not hesitate. She did not weep. She did not beg. She stood, smoothed the front of her grey dress, and adjusted the pins in her hair with a steady, clinical hand. To be invisible was a private art of survival, but there were moments when visibility was the only currency left. She walked to the door and opened it, stepping out onto the threshold before the man with the torch could reach the thatch. The sunlight, such as it was, caught the ink-stained fingers of her right hand as she rested them against the doorframe. Silas Blackwood turned his horse, his expression shifting from arrogance to a sharp, suspicious curiosity. He knew Clarissa Penhaligon. He knew her as the woman who could find a missing halfpenny in a 1,000-page audit. He knew her as the silent architect of Oakhaven's resilience. He did not see a thief, he saw a complication. Clarissa looked up at him, her gaze level and cold, reflecting the grey sky. She did not speak of the jewel. She did not speak of the theft. She spoke of the law. She reminded the magistrate, her voice carrying a rhythmic, authoritative weight, that the steward's house was protected by a royal charter of 1792, and that any harm to the communal records would be a direct violation of the Crown's administrative peace. She stood as a barrier, between the fire and the history of her people, a figure of bombazine and iron will. Blackwood laughed, a dry, hollow sound that did not reach his eyes. He leaned down from his saddle, the smell of wet leather and expensive tobacco surrounding her. He sneered that charters were for those who could afford the lawyers to defend them, and that Oakhaven was a village of debtors. He gave her an hour to produce the thief or the jewel, or he would see the cottage, and everything within it, reduced to ash. He did not care for the villagers' lives. He cared only for the recovery of the missing artifact, the sapphire that held the secret of his own crimes. Clarissa watched him ride away toward the grain silo, his men following like a dark tide. She stood in the mud, her boots soaking through, and counted the seconds. The audit was no longer a matter of grain and gold. It was a matter of time and truth. She looked back into the cottage at the floorboard beneath the stove. The ledger of their lives was no longer in balance, and the only way to restore it was to force the reigning lord to look into his own heart. She walked back inside and closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place, like the final entry in a closing account. She had 60 minutes to transform a stolen secret into a weapon of salvation. She sat beside Elspeth and took the girl's cold hand in hers, her mind already moving through the internal geometry of the next hour. She did not feel fear. She felt the heavy, quiet certainty of a woman who had finally found the missing figure in a corrupt calculation. The infamous prize was no longer a jewel. It was a contract of blood, and Clarissa Penhaligon was the only person with the skill to sign it. The grandfather clock in the corner of the cottage was a skeletal sentinel of dark oak, its rhythmic, heavy ticking marking the devaluation of their remaining time. Clarissa Penhaligon sat by the hearth, her posture as rigid as the columns of an audit, listening to the shallow, whistling breath of her sister, Elspeth. The night of the 16th had bled into the early frozen hours of the 17th, and the 60-minute ultimatum delivered by Silas Blackwood was no longer a distant threat. It was a mathematical constraint to be managed before the sun rose. She looked at the floorboard beneath the iron stove, where the heat had begun to warm the wood, and felt the phantom weight of the stolen sapphire against her palm. She did not allow her mind to drift toward the image of the gallows or the smell of smoke. Instead, she focused on the internal geometry of the lock mechanism. The Royal Charter of 1792 had sourced the magistrate, but ink on old parchment could only hold back a fire for so long. She rose from the chair, the bombazine of her skirts whispering against the floor, and knelt by the stove. The iron was hot, the acrid smell of wood ash and damp soot filling her senses, but her fingers were steady as she pried the loose board from its resting place. She withdrew the massive pendant, the stone catching the dim glow of the embers and refracting it into a bruised purple. Beside it lay the sliver of vellum she had already found, the Blackwood pardon. Yet Clarissa felt a nagging inconsistency in the weight of the gold setting. She had spent a decade repairing the intricate gears of the village looms and the heavy iron clockwork of the ruined mill. She knew the grammar of gravity. The sapphire was too light for its volume, and the gold filigree forming the heavy backing was far too dense. There was another layer of logic hidden within the vault, a matter of physics, not of magic. Returning to the table, she placed the jewel upon the scarred pine and withdrew a set of fine steel calipers from the drawer where she kept her stewardship tools. She did not act with haste. She measured the depth of the setting, the thickness of the hinges, and the precise angle of the golden leaves that formed the outer casing. The magnificent locket functioned not merely as a jewel. It was a masterpiece of horological architecture, a nested series of locks designed by a man who feared the very air he breathed. It was an ironclad contract disguised as an ornament. Clarissa noticed that 3 of the golden leaves were slightly more worn than the others, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th, prime numbers, the universal language of the meticulous. She used the needle from her lapel to depress the 3rd leaf, then the 5th, and finally the 7th. There was no sound, only a tactile vibration that traveled through the needle into the bone of her thumb. The central sapphire did not merely open this time. It shifted on a hidden axis, sliding upward to reveal a secondary, deeper compartment lined with velvet, the color of dried blood. Inside lay a second sliver of vellum, even smaller than the first, and a tiny, silver key no larger than a grain of rye. Clarissa's breath hitched, a singular, sharp sound in the quiet cottage. She used the calipers to extract the parchment, her ink-stained fingers moving with the delicate precision of a surgeon. As she unrolled the second document, the handwriting changed. It was no longer the jagged, arrogant script of Silas Blackwood. It was a neat, scholarly hand, the hand of the previous Duke of Hertford, written in the final hours of his life. Clarissa leaned closer to the tallow candle, her eyes scanning the cramped lines. It was a record of the Hertford estate, a detailed audit of the regional agricultural yields and tenant revenues from a decade ago. She followed the figures with practiced ease, her mind performing the long division as she read. She compared these true numbers to the meager, communal grains, stores meticulously tracked by Martha over the years, realizing the magnitude of the discrepancy. The numbers painted a portrait of systemic financial slaughter. Silas Blackwood had not only embezzled funds, he had systematically undervalued the estate's production. He had been siphoning off a fortune in raw grain and community resources, selling them to the Crown's adversaries during the height of the war. This was not mere theft. This was high treason, meticulously logged in the shadows of Oakhaven. The vellum was not a letter. It was a death warrant, held in reverse. Clarissa felt a cold, sharp realization settle over her. The current Duke, Julian Vane, had been born into a legacy of manufactured shame. He had been forced to pay a triple tax to the Crown, to atone for a crime his father never committed. It was a debt that Silas Blackwood had orchestrated, and then offered to manage as the local magistrate. Julian was not the predator. He was the primary victim of the magistrate's accounting. He was a man being bled dry, his reputation held hostage by the very mechanism Clarissa now held in her hand. The stolen pendant remained the sole proof that the Vane name was clean, and that the Blackwood name belonged to the executioner. Clarissa looked at the silver key. It was notched with a complexity that suggested a very specific lock, likely a private ledger box kept within the magistrate's office at the village green. She understood the grand strategy now. Blackwood held the crushing debt over the estate, but the Duke held the confession locked around his neck, and neither could move against the other without destroying themselves. It was a stalemate of ruins, but Silas Blackwood had grown greedy. He had pushed the village too far with the winter famine, and in doing so he had invited a third party into the calculation. He had invited a woman who understood that a ledger in balance was the only form of true justice. A soft moan from the bed drew Clarissa's attention away from the parchment. Elspeth was awake, her eyes clouded with the glassiness of high fever. The young girl tried to speak, but her voice was a dry rattle, a sound that Clarissa recorded in her mind as the most urgent debt of all. She moved to the bed, tucking the quilt tighter around her sister's shoulders, feeling the terrifying heat radiating from the frail body. Elspeth's hand was a bundle of cold, fragile bones. To save the village, Clarissa had to ruin Blackwood. To ruin Blackwood, she had to return the heart to the Duke. But to return the heart was to confess to a crime that carried the penalty of death. It was a matter of survival, not of morality. She would trade her own neck to ensure her sister saw another spring. The sound of a single horse approaching the Penhaligon cottage broke the frozen silence of the night. It was not the rhythmic, heavy thud of the magistrate's cavalry, nor was it the chaotic splashing of the village's draft horses. It was a clean, sharp gait, the sound of a thoroughbred moving with a purpose that bypassed the mud. It was just past midnight on the 17th, the exact hour Julian Vane had spent tracking her through the biting frost. Clarissa did not flinch. She did not scramble to hide the jewel, the vellum, or the silver key. She stood, smoothing the front of her dark bombazine dress, and waited. She counted the seconds between the horse stopping and the first footfall on the porch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds. A man of deliberation, a man who was counting his own mistakes in the dark. The door did not burst open. There was a knock, firm, measured, and completely stripped of the arrogance that usually accompanied the gentry. Clarissa walked to the door and pulled it open, the cold morning air, rushing in to meet the meager warmth of the hearth. Standing on the threshold was Julian Vane, the master of the estate. He was alone, his heavy greatcoat dark with the clinging mist, his winter-grey eyes fixed upon Clarissa, with an intensity that seemed to audit her very soul. He did not look like a man searching for a thief. He looked like a man who had finally tracked the source of a lingering, phantom pain. Julian stepped into the cottage without waiting for an invitation, his formidable presence immediately shrinking the dimensions of the room. He smelled of freezing rain, old leather-bound library books, and the sharp, clean scent of winter cedar. He never glanced at the modest furnishings, nor did he stare at the sick girl trembling on the bed. His gaze fell instantly upon the dismantled locket resting on the scarred pine table, lying open and dismantled like a conquered fortress. The silence between them was a heavy, pressurized thing, measured by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Julian did not reach for the sapphire. He kept his hands at his sides, his fingers twitching once, a small, suppressed sign of a man struggling to maintain his stoicism in the face of his own salvation. He spoke with a voice that was low, level, and possessed a rhythmic cadence that perfectly matched Clarissa's own internal monologue. He revealed he had tracked her not by the mud on her boots, nor by the panicked whispers of the servants at the Hartford estate study. He had found her by following the logic of the theft itself. He had realized that only someone who intimately understood the internal geometry of a lock and the internal geometry of an insurmountable debt would have known where to look and how to strike. He had studied the communal grain stores, realizing that only someone who fought for every single bushel could possess the audacity to break into his study. He had searched the records of the village and found the name of the steward who had kept the village ledger in perfect balance for a decade. He knew she was the one. He knew she had stolen his heart in every sense the ledger allowed. Clarissa did not lower her gaze. She did not curtsy. She stood with a straight spine, her ink-stained fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. She explained she had not stolen the jewel for the gold, nor for the beauty of the stone. She had taken it because Silas Blackwood had placed a price on the lives of 300 people that Oakhaven could never pay. She added she had found the hidden compartment, operating the mechanism he had carried blindly for years. She had read the Blackwood pardon, and she had audited the records of the Hartford estate. She spoke to the Duke of percentages, of forged yields, and of the treason that had been used to shackle his proud name to a corrupt magistrate's greed. Julian flinched at the word treason. The mask of aristocratic indifference fractured for a fleeting second, revealing a depth of weariness that Clarissa recognized as a mirror of her own. He approached the table, his tall shadow falling over the open sapphire. He admitted, his voice rougher now, that he had known of the pardon's existence, but he had never been able to trigger the secondary mechanism. He had spent years staring at the cold stone, sensing the truth buried within, but lacking the technical and mechanical skill to release it. He looked at Clarissa, and for the first time in his life he did not see a villager or a subordinate. He saw a peer, an intellectual equal who had accomplished in one night what he had failed to do in a lifetime of privileged isolation. He warned the steward that Silas Blackwood was coming for the village ledger. The magistrate knew that the Duke was momentarily vulnerable due to the theft, and he intended to use the hour's ultimatum as a pretext to burn the stewardship records and erase the evidence of his own crimes once and for all. Julian had come not to arrest her, but to warn her. He had no power to stop Blackwood legally. The debt held by the magistrate was too absolute, the political leverage too deeply entrenched. He was a duke in name, but a prisoner in reality. Clarissa looked at the silver key on the table, a tiny sliver of metal against the wood, and then back at the wounded aristocrat who stood before her. She did not feel the desperation that had originally driven her to the manor. She felt the quiet, private art of survival, turning into a devastating strategic maneuver. She picked up the silver key and held it out to him, the metal cold against her thumb. She told him that the ledger of their lives was currently in a state of insolvency, but that a partnership of absolute necessity could restore the balance. She would give him the hollowed treasure and the irrefutable evidence of his innocence. In return, he would provide the aristocratic authority she needed to execute a final, public audit of Silas Blackwood's accounts on the village green. Julian looked at the key, then at the permanent stains of ink on Clarissa's fingers, recognizing them as the marks of a fellow soldier in a different kind of war. He understood the subtext of her offer. It was not a plea for mercy. It was an unbreakable contract of restoration. He reached out and took the key, his hand brushing intentionally against hers. The contact was brief, a sudden, startling spark of heat in the freezing room, but it was enough to acknowledge the seismic shift in their dynamic. They were no longer the master and the thief. They were the architects of a common salvation, bound by logic and an unspoken, rising respect. Outside, the first chime of the Oakhaven village bell began to ring through the mist, signaling the start of the final hour. Clarissa turned back to the hearth, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock now sounding like the steady pulse of an unstoppable plan. The dismantled vault ceased to be a secret. It was the heavy, golden foundation of the reckoning that was about to begin. She looked at the ledger, then at the Duke, and finally understood the true weight of her inheritance. They were no longer victims of the winter frost. They were the architects of its end. Julian Vane did not pull his hand away immediately. The contact between his gloved fingers and the ink-stained skin of Clarissa Penhaligon's palm was not a gesture of affection. It was a bridge of cold necessity, a grounding wire through which the terrifying charge of the truth was being conducted. The silver key, tiny and intricate, sat between them like a seed of destruction. Julian's winter-grey eyes remained fixed on Clarissa, searching for a tremor of greed or the heat of a common criminal. He found only the analytical gaze of a woman who had spent a lifetime counting the cost of other people's mistakes. The nobleman finally withdrew his hand, the key clutched in his palm as he turned back to the table. The magnificent relic lay there, its golden leaves splayed open like the ribs of a fallen animal. To see it thus, dismantled by a village steward in a cottage that smelled of pennyroyal, was a profound violation of his reality. He had carried that sapphire since his father's death, believing it a symbol of his family's weight. He had never suspected the gold was not a sanctuary for a stone, but a casing for a catastrophe. He looked at the second vellum, the one Clarissa had extracted using the prime number triggers, and his breath became a shallow hitch. He picked up the parchment with the reverence a man might show to a letter from the dead. The scholarly, meticulous hand of the previous duke was unmistakable. Julian's fingers traced the ink as his mind processed the rows of numbers Clarissa had already audited. He spoke in a voice that was barely a rasping whisper, noting these figures were not the ones presented to the Crown's auditors 10 years ago. These were the true yields of the Hertford mines and northern fields, the raw data of a prosperous estate systematically reported as insolvent. He looked at Clarissa, the mask of the distant protector falling away to reveal a man, seeing the architecture of his own cage. Clarissa did not speak to comfort him. She spoke to orient him. She pointed to a column representing a massive diversion of naval timber in 1812. She explained, with the level tone of a woman documenting a missing bushel of rye, that Silas Blackwood had been performing a dual accounting of the entire county. He had sold resources to privateers and reported the losses as results of the war's blockades. He had used the Duke's name to sign the manifests, framing the Vane family for a treason Blackwood himself orchestrated. The triple tax Julian had paid for years was not a debt of honor. It was the interest on a lie the magistrate used to fund his own ascension. Julian Vane stood as if struck, his shadow lengthening against the cottage wall. To be a duke was to be a pillar of the realm, and to be a pillar was to be immobile. He realized his immobility had been Blackwood's greatest weapon. The magistrate had banked on Julian's aristocratic stoicism, knowing the duke would rather pay a ruinous tax than risk the public shame of an inquiry. He had banked on Julian's inability to understand the dirty business of bookkeeping and mechanical locks. Blackwood assumed a man of the gentry would never look beneath the surface of a royal jewel. Julian looked at Clarissa, and the subtext of the room shifted. He realized this woman, whom he had once categorized as an administrative necessity, possessed the weapon he lacked, the ability to see through status into the mechanical truth of the ledger. She was not a thief. She was the auditor of his salvation. He asked her, his voice regaining its rhythmic edge, if she understood what would happen if Blackwood found her with these documents. The magistrate was not merely a greedy man. He was a traitor with armed men and the legal authority to burn Oakhaven to the ground to protect his secret. Clarissa moved toward the bed where Elspeth lay, the younger girls breathing a sharp whistling sound in the silence. She adjusted the quilt, her touch clinical and devoid of hysteria. She told him she had already weighed the risk of the gallows against the certainty of the winter famine. She stated that her life was a single entry in a much larger account, and if her death was the price of survival, she would accept the deficit. But she was not interested in sacrifice. She was interested in a victory. They had less than an hour before Blackwood returned to execute his ultimatum. The negotiation was born in the silence that followed. Julian Vane and Clarissa Penhaligon stood on either side of the dismantled heart of Hartford. No longer defined by inheritance or etiquette, they were bound by the hard logic of mutual ruin. Julian told her the silver key was intended for a private iron-bound box in Blackwood's office, a box likely containing the original manifests and signatures of the privateers. If they could present those alongside the confession found in the jewel, they could strip the magistrate of his authority before the first torch was lit. But Julian was a man being watched. Every move he made toward the green would be reported by Blackwood's men. He was the figurehead, easily tracked. Clarissa, however, was the steward. She knew the back alleys of Oakhaven and the exact timing of the watchman's rounds. She had the technical skill to operate the lock and the knowledge of what to look for. Julian would provide the distraction, demanding a public meeting at the village well to discuss the tax levy, drawing Blackwood into the open. Clarissa would use that window to infiltrate the office. The Duke looked at the sick girl on the bed, his winter-grey eyes softening. He asked Clarissa what she required in return, beyond the safety of the village. He expected her to ask for gold or a pardon. Clarissa did not hesitate. She required the Hartford estate's surplus grain to be released to the Oakhaven silos immediately. She required a formal contract recognizing the village's autonomy from arbitrary levies, and she required a physician from the city for her sister, to be paid for in perpetuity by the Duke's personal account. Julian Vane nodded, the gesture a final, binding signature on their agreement. He did not ask how she would get past the locks. He knew her competence was a force of nature. He reached into his coat and withdrew a heavy, gold-handled signet ring, placing it on the table. He told her that if she were caught, she was to produce the ring and claim she was acting under his direct orders. It was a flimsy shield against a man like Blackwood, but it was the only piece of authority he could spare without tipping his hand. Clarissa picked up the ring. It was not a piece of jewelry. It was a contract of blood. She slipped it into the hidden pocket of her skirts, alongside the second vellum. The ticking of the grandfather clock was now a countdown to the final reckoning. The audit of their lives was no longer a private matter of secrets hidden in a sapphire. She told the Duke he should leave before the mist lifted and informants saw his horse at her gate. She would meet him at the green in 50 minutes, when the final chime rang out. Julian moved toward the door, stopping for a moment on the threshold. He looked back at the woman in grey bombazine, standing among her ledgers. He admitted he had spent his life guarding a heart he believed was made of stone. He realized now he had been wrong. His heart was not a secret to be kept. It was a legacy to be tended. And he had been a poor steward of his own soul. He told her that if they survived the morning, he would seek to learn the grammar of survival from her. Clarissa did not smile. She countered that survival was a matter of mathematics, not of emotion, and that they were currently in a state of deep insolvency. She watched him mount his horse and disappear into the grey mist, the sound of hooves a fading rhythm against the frozen mud. She was alone again, but the silence was no longer heavy with the threat of ash. It was humming with the energy of a plan in motion. She began to reassemble the ornate casing, leaving the mechanism open, a hollowed-out shell of a father's shame. She took her reticule and her calipers, her fingers moving with a rhythmic pulse that mimicked the clock. She looked at Elspeth, whose eyes were closed in fitful sleep, and whispered a promise born of calculated certainty. The winter would not take them. They were the architects of their own restoration, and the final hour was finally here. Clarissa stepped into the cold, the mist clinging to her hair like silver frost. She did not look like a revolutionary. She looked like a woman going to her morning work, a ledger tucked under her arm. She began the walk toward the village green, her footsteps measured and deliberate. The royal adornment was no longer a jewel, and Julian Vane was no longer a distant master. They were the two halves of a singular truth, and before the sun reached its zenith, they would see the ledger of Oakhaven balanced. The morning air was sharp, tasting of wet iron. Clarissa counted the seconds as she walked, 50 minutes, 300 seconds. one chance to unmake a decade of lies. She reached the edge of the woods and saw the torches flickering near the magistrate's office, the orange light reflecting off the grey stones of the church. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and Clarissa Penhaligon, the silent architect of dignity, was ready to deliver the blow to the man who thought numbers could be hidden forever. The village bell began its resonant, heavy toll, signaling the expiration of the hour she had been granted. To the fearful, it sounded like a funeral knell for Oakhaven. To Clarissa, it sounded like the steady, unstoppable ticking of a clock that had finally found its gear. She adjusted her shawl, straightened her spine, and stepped out of the shadows into the light of the green. The reckoning had begun, and the numbers would no longer lie. She was not merely a steward. She was the executor of a legacy Silas Blackwood could never understand. The heart was open, and the public audit was about to commence. The Oakhaven village green was a stage of frozen mud and desperate silence, lit by the flickering, orange tongues of pitch torches that smelled of impending ruin. Silas Blackwood sat atop his black stallion, a figure of dark wool and arrogant certainty, his gaze sweeping over the gathered villagers like an auditor looking for a missing decimal point. The 1-hour ultimatum had expired, and the air was thick with the scent of wet leather and the metallic tang of the coming snow. Clarissa Penhaligon stood at the edge of the crowd, her spine a straight line of repressed indignity, her ink-stained fingers hidden within the folds of her bombazine skirts. She did not look at the magistrate. She looked at the space between the people, calculating the geometric possibility of a miracle. The crowd was not a collection of neighbors. It was a wall of communal breath, held in collective suspension as Julian Vane, the Duke of Hertford, stepped into the light. He moved with a stiff, aristocratic grace that seemed to push back the encroaching shadows. He did not look at Clarissa, yet the weight of their midnight contract was a palpable force between them. Julian took his place opposite Blackwood, his winter-grey eyes reflecting the torchlight with a cold, analytical brilliance. He was the distraction, the primary entry, in a ledger designed to mislead the predator. The Duke spoke, his voice carrying the rhythmic authority of a man who had finally found his footing, demanding a public review of the tax charter before a single torch was laid to the stewardship cottage. In the periphery of the confrontation, George Miller, the Duke's valet, moved with the quiet invisibility of a man who had spent a lifetime in the shadows of power. He passed behind Clarissa, his shoulder brushing hers for a fleeting second. In that millisecond of contact, he pressed a small folded piece of drafting paper into her hand. It was a map of the magistrate's office, marked with the precise locations of the watchman's rotations. George's face remained a mask of servant-class neutrality, but his eyes signaled a grim alliance. He was the inside contact, the silent witness who had watched Blackwood's corruption grow like a mold behind the manor's wainscoting. Clarissa did not unfold the paper. She memorized the weight of it, her mind already performing a psychological audit of the village green. She watched Julian Vane engage Blackwood in a technical dispute regarding the Royal Charter of 1792, a move designed to draw the magistrate's full attention and the focus of his armed guards. It was a matter of logistics, not of emotion. Blackwood, fueled by a decade of uncontested dominance, leaned down from his saddle to sneer at the Duke, his voice a dry rasp of social cruelty. He did not notice the steward in the grey dress slipping away into the mist, her movements as methodical and rhythmic as the ticking of a clock. The transition from the light of the green to the shadows behind the magistrate's office was a shift in atmospheric pressure. Clarissa moved through the narrow alleyways of Oakhaven, the smell of coal smoke replaced by the scent of damp stone and the sharp acidic tang of neglected justice. She reached the rear entrance of the stone building that served as both jail and treasury. The wood was old oak, reinforced with iron bands that felt like ice against her fingers. She did not hesitate. She did not tremble. She withdrew her steel calipers and the silver key from her reticule, her mind focusing on the internal logic of the lock. The office was a monument to the gravity of stolen wealth, a room that tasted of old parchment and the heavy, suffocating dust of a decade's worth of lies. Clarissa closed the door behind her, the sound of the latch, a finalized internal realization. The room was dark, save for the thin, anemic light of the moon filtering through the barred windows. She did not move toward the desk. She moved toward the corner, where a heavy iron-bound box sat bolted to the floorboards. This was the target of her theft, the secondary proof required to balance the scales. The box was not a container. It was a fortress of administrative treason. Clarissa knelt before it, her bombazine skirts rustling against the grit of the floor. She felt the surface of the iron, tracing the seams until she found the keyhole. It was a double-lever mechanism, far more complex than the study door at the manor. But Clarissa Penhaligon possessed the specialized skill of a woman who had spent a lifetime repairing the broken machinery of her village. She inserted the silver key, feeling for the tension of the tumblers, her ears tuned to the micro-clicks of the rotating gears. She counted the shifts in her mind. 1, 2, 3. On the fourth rotation, the mechanism gave a singular, heavy thud of surrender. Inside the box, the air was cold and smelled of sulfur and expensive ink. Clarissa did not reach for the gold coins stacked in the corners. She reached for the paper. She found the hidden tax ledgers, a series of thin, leather-bound books that documented the magistrate's private reality. These were the true records of Oakhaven's production, the ones that had never been seen by the Duke or the Crown's auditors. She opened the first ledger, her ink-stained fingers moving with a precision that bypassed the fear of discovery. She performed a mental audit of the entries, comparing them to the memories of Martha Higgins's grain counts and her own village ledger. The discrepancy was a mathematical massacre. Silas Blackwood had been recording the village's output at 40% of its actual value, pocketing the difference in raw grain and livestock. He had then leveraged the resulting poverty to justify the triple tax, effectively enslaving the population to pay off a debt that he himself was manufacturing. Clarissa followed the trail of ink through the years, noting the names of privateers and the specific dates of illegal timber shipments. The numbers did not lie. They sang a song of high treason and systematic theft. She found the original manifests, signed in Blackwood's jagged, arrogant hand, documenting the sale of the Duke's naval timber to the king's enemies. Clarissa felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. She was no longer just a thief or a steward. She was the architect of a public moral reckoning. She took the ledgers and the treasonous manifests, slipping them into the reinforced pocket of her shawl. She did not rush her exit. She took a moment to relock the iron-bound box, ensuring the room appeared undisturbed. Stewardship was a matter of order, even in the midst of a revolution. She stood, her spine straight, her breathing measured, and prepared to step back into the light of the green. The hollowed sapphire was waiting, and the Duke was holding the line. Outside, the village bell began a new, rhythmic tolling, a signal from George Miller that the guards were shifting their positions. Clarissa stepped into the alleyway, the cold air rushing into her lungs like a tonic of pure logic. She could hear Blackwood's voice rising in anger, the sound of a man losing control of a calculation he thought he had mastered. She did not run. She walked with the quiet, authoritative gait of a woman who had already balanced the ledger. The reckoning was no longer a plan. It was a physical certainty, moving toward its zenith with the unstoppable force of a falling weight. As she rounded the corner of the church, she saw Martha Higgins standing at the edge of the light, her eyes searching the shadows. Clarissa gave a singular, sharp nod, a gesture of shared restoration. The village was no longer a victim of the winter frost. It was a witness to its end. Clarissa adjusted the weight of the hidden ledgers against her ribs. The paper a shield of truth that Silas Blackwood could never penetrate. She stepped onto the village green, the torches reflecting in her eyes like the dawn of a new era. The heart of the Duke was open, and the audit of Silas Blackwood was about to be presented in full. The confrontation at the well had reached a fever pitch. Silas Blackwood had drawn his sword, the steel flashing with a malevolent, orange light. He was shouting about the duel, about the gallows, about the absolute power of his office. Julian Vane stood unmoved, his presence a monument to a dignity that Blackwood could never comprehend. Clarissa walked toward them, the crowd parting like a receding tide. She did not shout. She did not scream. She spoke with a voice that was level, formal, and carried the weight of 10 years of silent labor. She told the magistrate that the 1-hour ultimatum was over, and that the account of Oakhaven was finally ready for a public audit. Blackwood turned his horse toward her, his face a mask of predatory rage. He demanded to know where the jewel was. Clarissa reached into her shawl, her fingers closing not on the sapphire, but on the hidden tax ledgers. She told him that the jewel was exactly where it belonged, in the hands of the man he had spent a decade trying to ruin. She proclaimed the treasure was no longer a secret, and that the vellum inside it had already been matched to the manifests she held in her hand. The silence that followed her words was absolute, a collective, terrifying realization that the hierarchy of Oakhaven had been permanently inverted. Clarissa looked at Julian Vane, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine hope in his winter-grey eyes. He was no longer the wounded aristocrat. He was the partner in her restoration. She held up the leather-bound book, the hidden tax ledger that documented Blackwood's treason. This was the final piece of the architecture, the golden foundation of their victory. She told the villagers, her voice echoing through the cold morning air, that the debt they owed was a lie, and that the man who had starved them was the only debtor left in Oakhaven. The reckoning had arrived, and the numbers were finally perfectly in balance. Silas Blackwood stared at the ledger, the torches reflecting the sudden, hollow terror in his eyes as he realized that he was the only thing left to be liquidated. The audit was over, and the restoration of dignity had begun. Silas Blackwood did not move for a count of 10 seconds, his body frozen in an exquisite posture of arrested arrogance. The torches flickered, casting a sickly orange light across his features, which had shifted from the flushed red of rage to a grey, papery pallor. He looked at the leather-bound book in Clarissa Penhaligon's hand, the hidden tax ledger she had just extracted from his own iron-bound box, and then at the aristocratic heir, who stood like a silent executioner at the well. The village green was a vacuum of sound, the breathing of 300 people suspended in the freezing air. Blackwood's hand, still clutching the hilt of his sword, began a microscopic tremor that he could not suppress. He was a man who understood the finality of a closed account, and he was looking at the terminal entry of his career. Clarissa stepped forward, her boots heavy in the frozen mud, but her spine was a monument to unyielding stewardship. She did not shout. She did not seek the theatricality of a victim's cry. She spoke with the level, methodical cadence of an auditor delivering a quarterly report. She stated that the records contained within the iron-bound box did not merely document theft. They documented the systematic liquidation of the Oakhaven community for private gain. She opened the ledger to the year 1812 and read aloud the figures of the naval timber sales. Shipments that had been officially reported as lost to the blockade, but were here recorded as sold to privateers in Bristol. She traced the ink through the columns, her finger following the trail of every bushel of grain and every head of cattle that had been stolen from the communal stores to line the magistrates' pockets. The Duke moved then, his heavy greatcoat sweeping the ground as he approached the magistrate. Julian Vane did not look at the sword at Blackwood's hip. He looked only at the man's eyes, his winter-grey gaze, holding a depth of cold fury that Clarissa realized had been simmering for a decade. Julian held up the heart of Hertford, the sapphire now hollowed out, its golden leaves splayed like a broken ribcage. He spoke with a voice that echoed through the silence of the green, announcing that the confession of the framing of the previous Duke was now in the hands of the Crown's investigators. He told Blackwood that the royal sapphire represented not merely a jewel, it was a contract of blood that had finally been fulfilled. The magistrate's authority, Julian declared, was not a shield of the law, but a shroud of treason that was about to be burned. Blackwood tried to find his voice, a dry, rattling sound that failed to produce a coherent defense. He looked to his armed guards, men who had been paid with the very funds he had embezzled from the estate. But they did not move. They stood in the shadows of the church, their torches dipping toward the ground, their faces masks of the same realization that had gripped the magistrate. They were soldiers of a lost cause, and the Duke's presence, backed by the irrefutable evidence in the steward's hand, was a force of nature they could not oppose. The hierarchy of Oakhaven, which had been built on fear and the leverage of debt, collapsed in the space between two breaths. Julian Vane signaled to George Miller, and the valet stepped forward with 2 men from the manor, their movements as precise and rhythmic as the ticking of a clock. They did not arrest Blackwood. With violence, they removed him with the same clinical efficiency one might use to extract a parasite. As they led the magistrate away toward the stone jail at the edge of the green, the villagers finally broke their silence. It was not a cheer. It was a low, rising hum of collective restoration, the sound of a lung finally taking in air after a long period of suffocating pressure. Clarissa watched them, her mind still performing the psychological audit of the moment. She did not feel the heat of victory. She felt the heavy, quiet satisfaction of a ledger that had finally reached a state of perfect balance. She looked at Martha Higgins, who was weeping silently into her apron, and gave the older woman a singular, sharp nod of recognition. The debt was settled, and the winter would no longer be a sentence of death. The sun began to rise over the Hartford estate, a pale, golden wash that turned the frost on the village green into a field of diamonds. Clarissa Penhaligon stood by the communal grain silo, her fingers tracing the rough, splintered wood of the door she had audited in despair only weeks ago. But the silence of the silo was no longer hollow. Behind her, the heavy, rhythmic thud of grain sacks being unloaded from the Duke's wagons filled the air, a symphony of abundance that Oakhaven had not heard in a generation. Julian Vane had not waited for the paperwork to be finalized. He had released the Hartford reserves the moment the magistrate was under lock and key. It was a matter of survival, not of bureaucracy, and for the first time in her life, Clarissa saw a man of the gentry act with the same urgency as a steward. Julian approached her, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. His winter-grey eyes no longer held the clouded distance of a man being extorted. He stood beside her as they watched the villagers carry the wheat and rye into the silo, his presence a quiet, formidable pillar of support. He did not speak of the sapphire, nor did he mention the crime of the theft that had brought them to this threshold. He spoke instead of the estate's future, a future that required the intellectual precision and the steadfast integrity of a woman who understood the grammar of the soil, as well as the grammar of the ledger. He told her that he had spent his life guarding a heart he believed was made of stone, only to find that it was the woman with ink-stained fingers who had shown him how to make it beat for the people he was meant to protect. He reached into his coat and withdrew the physician's report for Elspeth, which had arrived by special courier an hour ago. He handed it to Clarissa, his hand brushing hers with a deliberate, lingering warmth that she did not pull away from. The report stated that with the medicine and nutrition now provided, the younger sister's lungs were clearing, and the fever had broken for good. Clarissa looked at the parchment, her analytical mind absorbing the medical data with the same intensity she gave to a tax audit. The deficit of her sister's health had been reversed. The account was in the black. She looked up at the Duke, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, the mask of the competent stoic softened. She did not cry, but her eyes held a depth of quiet triumph that was more powerful than any outburst. They walked together toward the Penhaligon cottage, the air smelling of wood smoke, and the sharp, clean scent of cedar. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room was still ticking, but the sound was no longer a countdown to ruin. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse of a life being restored. Clarissa sat by her sister's bed, holding Elspeth's hand, which was now warm and steady. Julian stood by the hearth, a man who had finally found a home in the very place he had come to investigate as a ruin. He told Clarissa that he would be initiating a formal audit of every estate in the county, and he required a chief steward who could not be bought, intimidated, or misled by the arrogance of power. He was not offering a job. He was offering a partnership in the architecture of a new dignity. Clarissa looked at the village ledger resting on the pine table, its vellum pages now filled with the records of restitution and the cancellation of the triple tax. She realized that her private art of survival had become a public blueprint for justice. She told him that she would accept the position, provided that the stewardship of Oakhaven remained her primary focus, a condition Julian accepted with a solemn, respectful nod. They were no longer the master and the thief, nor were they the aristocrat and the peasant. They were two architects who had survived the frost and learned that true power lay in the meticulous restoration of what was broken. The Vane family legacy stood no longer as a secret locked in a sapphire. It was the steady, living truth of two souls who had found their match in the cold. As the evening began to fall, Clarissa walked one final time to the edge of the woods, looking back at the village. The torches were lit again, but they were no longer the orange tongues of pitch and impending ruin. They were the warm, steady lights of hearths that would not go out, and homes that would not be burned. She reached into her pocket and felt the Duke's signet ring, which he had insisted she keep as a symbol of her permanent authority. She did not wear it for vanity. She wore it as a reminder of the night she had balanced the ledger of an entire world. She looked up at the stars, which were as bright and cold as the sapphire she had once stolen, and felt a profound, expansive sense of earned serenity. The audit was finished. The restoration was complete. The ledger of Oakhaven was finally, perfectly, and irrevocably in balance.